Welcome everyone to Reimagining Chinatown, Speculative Fiction Stories from Toronto's Chinatowns in 2050. We meet today on ceded land covered under Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and it continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. As an immigrant and a daughter of immigrants, I believe to be a good neighbor means to reflect and actively participate in truth and reconciliation. I am grateful for the opportunity to work and live on this land. This event is being recorded and live streamed on the Daniels YouTube channel. Please use the Q&A and chat to respond to the presentations, to share links and stories, and to ask questions. Tonight, we will begin with a history of this project before each author offers a short presentation based on their story. The authors will join the moderators in a discussion, and we will respond to your questions and reflections during the second half of the event. My name is Erica Allen Kim, and I am an assistant professor at the Daniels faculty. We are delighted to start off our second to last event in our winter's program, Reimagining Chinatown, with our guests, Linda Zhang, Biko Mandela Gray, Michael Chong, Amelia Gan, Evelyn Lamb, and Amy Yan. The Ongyi people of the Andaman Islands practice a collective form of storytelling through dreams. Individually, they visit the same dream island at night. Each evening, as described by anthropologist Vishwajit Pandya, they describe their dreams to each other. Through a process of negotiation and revision, their dream accounts of the island become aligned with each other. The writer Michael Clune suggests that this is a much more creative act of speculation and community building through an activity accessible to everyone. We all dream. In contrast, he notes, the interpretation of dreams has often been viewed as a source of individual rather than shared meaning in the modern Western world, and one in which experts, the psychoanalyst, is needed to help the dreamer understand themselves and potentially to even change their future. As the community authors speculate on the future of Chinatown in 2050, their stories offer a visionary act of resistance by uncovering new possible futures and bringing to light untold pasts. Chinatown itself is an illumination of the histories of diasporas for those who know how to see. It is both a place and a condition, between generations, between patterns of immigration, between identities, between others, between countries. By envisioning Chinatown anew, the stories create a radically more generous and expansive present moment by building a collective and shared vision for the future architecture of Toronto's Chinatowns. Now, please join me in welcoming Linda Zhang. Linda is an artist, licensed drone pilot, assistant professor at X University's interior design at the Creative School, and a principal at Studio Pararound. Her artistic practice explores community memory, cultural heritage, and identity as they are indexically embodied through emergent technologies, including VR and AR, matter and material processes. She grew up traveling hours with her family just to get groceries from Toronto's Chinatown West. Welcome, Linda.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I'll try to keep things short because I'd love to focus our conversation around these stories. I just wanted to share a little bit of context of how this came to be and how we got here. So I'm just going to share screen. So this project seeks to transform Chinatown by telling stories about our connection to place. These stories emerged from a community writing workshop, which took place in April 2020, which I cannot believe was 2 years ago, during Toronto's first pandemic lockdown. And so if we travel back in time together to that moment, we might remember the kind of media portrayals that there were of both Asian Canadians as well as Chinatown. And many of those more than century-long racial and false stereotypes of Chinatown, as a place that's morally corrupt, dirty, and its people as agents of infectious disease, these stereotypes resurfaced during this time, on one hand, And on the other hand, that very narrowing model of how Asian Canadians, as well as Chinatowns, ought to behave in face of rising anti-Asian violence, this also emerged in this time, and both shared heavily in this kind of modeling of this model minority myth. And so pushing back against these stereotypes of these kinds of stories that were all over the news and media at that time, our writing workshop invited community members to take part in a space where we could speculate and write speculative fiction stories as a way to reimagine what Toronto might look like in 30 years after the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, or at least back then we thought 20 years after the pandemic would be 2050. And so over 60 community members and facilitators came together to reimagine the future of Chinatown through fantastical, futuristic, and limitless imagining of what the future could be. So breaking from this narrowing future that was being told to us, the space was really to grapple with the complexity and irresolution of themes like tokenism, self-strategic orientalization, displacement, community power, othering, and the ancestral access to place and community, amongst many other emergent themes, and to not shy away from the kind of complexity and richness of those contestations. And so the narrative devices that speculative fiction afforded us also allowed for the expression and exploration of both individual and collective experiences of Chinatown, as well as Chinatown's relationship to Toronto. And the stories that they wrote looked to the future to identify questions and challenges that required our attention and exploration. And in particular, we focused a lot on the question of change. Who seeks change? Who seeks to present change? Are there others in the future worlds that seek different kinds of change? How does the need for change become apparent? And who ultimately is going to make this change? And how do they know that they've done it? And so against the COVID-19 context, we asked, how did new social or political systems take root following the pandemic? What was exacerbated and what sparked radical action? What are the assumptions we can make about this society in 2050, the history, the social structures, how people viewed life, death, technology, social distancing, as well as, in particular, community power? And what was the impact of this on individuals, on the community, and on the neighborhood? And so today, it is with great pleasure, I'm so excited to share the space with 4 of our authors and to share their stories about how they relate to placemaking, and community control for Chinatown. And through their stories, we will find ourselves exploring strange and yet familiar new Chinatowns, each story telling a particular writer's relationship to place, including its challenges, aspirations, their fears, their hopes. And yet in the space between these stories, we might also recognize a place where our own stories might start to emerge. Finally, I just want to close by acknowledging that the structure of our writing workshops and this anthology takes inspiration from the work of those who have come before us. And this in particular workshop includes Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Marisha, the authors of Octavia's Brood, a collection of speculative fiction stories written by American social justice movement leaders of color. And of course, this also then includes Octavia Butler, from which this collection is inspired. And the one thing I want to highlight in this is the importance of Black and Brown women in this movement who have organized around change through writing workshops and social dreaming, of which Asian communities have been allied with for a very long history. And when Octavia Brood initially wrote, she literally wrote Black women into science fiction for the first time. Octavia's Brood gave space for authors who were then not only science fiction writers, but in Octavia Brood, this taking another step further. In fact, the authors of that anthology that were invited to write were actually organizers, visionaries, change makers, and activists, not writers by trade. And so the editors of Octavia's Brood shared the belief that science fiction is for everybody and that all organizing is science fiction. So social dreaming is actually a form of organizing. And so here what I want to emphasize is sort of the generative force that exists in dreaming about new worlds and the power that that kind of dreaming actually has and holds for making change in the present. And so even though our stories are set in 2050, the anthology is very much about Chinatown today. Drawing inspiration from Octavia's Brood, our invitation to the workshop was open. It did not include any prerequisites to join. Instead, it was an open call through Myseum of Toronto. And priority was given particular to the Chinatown community members, as well as Asian Canadians at a time of heightened anti-Asian violence. And on screen, you were looking at some drone shots of Chinatown West in 2020 during the pandemic lockdown. So it's the emptiest you will ever see it. And through the radical break with the present moment, authors were free to explore themes affecting Chinatown today. So on screen here, you'll see Amy Yan's story, Chinatown Island, where by 2050, Chinatown has become physically, socially distanced from Toronto and displaced to Toronto Island as a theme park. And in this strange yet a familiar Chinatown world in 2050, we explore when Chinatown ceases to be Chinatown and who is Chinatown for anyway. Finally, I just want to conclude by acknowledging all of the incredible and amazing contributors, facilitators, and all around just incredible humans that have brought this project to life. Our incredible authors, Eva, Helen, Amelia, Imperatrice, Michael, Georgia, Tiffany, Razanne, Amy, Evelyn, and Robert, and our amazing facilitators, Maxime, Vico, Tyler, Erica, Morris, Shelley, Howard, Philip, and Lexi. Graphic design of the anthology by Jessica and illustrations by Amy, who is also one of our authors here today. I've had the incredible honor of learning so much in community with these amazing humans, and I'm just really thrilled to be able to share some of that space together with all of you in the audience joining us today. So back and over to you, Erica.
Thanks, Linda, for that really wonderful recap. And it is amazing to think that it was 2 years ago that we had that workshop. So I mean, there's a lot of last minute changes, and it came off really well. So thank you so much for that. So for the rest of this first half of the format of the event, I will introduce each of the authors, and then they will give a presentation, and then we will reconvene for a conversation led by moderator Biko. So first up is Michael Chong. Michael Chong grew up a 1.5 hour TTC ride from Chinatown West and would often drive there with his family on weekends to eat and shop for groceries. He currently lives around the corner from his grandmother and enjoys learning more about the city he grew up in. He graduated with a Master's of International Public Policy from the Balzilli School of International Affairs and is currently working as a software engineer at an insurance company. Welcome, Michael.
Cool. Thanks, Erica. I'm going to start things off with a short excerpt from my story, New Hong Fat Barbecue Restaurant. Your mom's homemade stuff was pretty good. Rachel was right. Matt's mom had come pretty close to replicating the marinade, but she didn't have the equipment to roast the pork at the proper temperature. And so in Matt's opinion, it still never really came close to the real thing. Hey, you never tasted her first attempts though. I can still feel in my mouth the taste of how dry that pork was. Matt had gone deep into some grill and smoker forums one week and bought the materials for a DIY standing oven for his mom's 70th birthday. But in the end, he couldn't find someone who could weld. And anyways, his mom never really cooked in that style anymore, since produce prices have become so expensive. Produce prices for Chinese veggies, and produce generally, had shot up when Loblaws had bought and then immediately closed the Ontario Food Terminal, the publicly run market that provided most of the independent Chinatown grocers with access to a supply of low-priced, quality produce. The closure, along with a citywide ban on single-use styrofoam and plastic wrap, forced most of the grocers to shut their doors in turn, as shoppers left to the nearby Freshco for the everyday lower prices propped up by private supply chains and the monopsony power to keep desperate bok choy farmers from breaking contracts and selling to anyone else. Over time, most of Chinatown's recognizable stores, banquet halls, eateries, and even the old family associations had closed or moved to the suburbs in search of cheaper rent. Gradually, the names that Matt's family used for their usual spots changed. Hey, want to go to the third floor this weekend? Became, the new AGO building, after the third floor restaurant, where every week Matt's family used to gather for dim sum, disappeared. Its building had been purchased by a well-intentioned art gallery of Ontario looking to expand its gift shop. The restaurant was turned into a Michelin-starred dim sum-themed restaurant, complete with cart service and featuring a rotating menu spotlighting a different area of China every month. A few years before that, the Lucky Moose had them on sale, had become, I was parked by the old moose, referring to the 90s era moose statue standing in front of the former Lucky Moose grocery by Dundas and Beverly. The old store was now boarded up and adorned with a faded mural depicting a bearded Justin Trudeau handing one of those life-size checks to a smiling Galen Weston. Both were wearing surgical masks and looking in desperate need of a hairstylist. It was a shame most of the $10 hair salons were also long closed. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Next up is Amelia. Amelia Gahn is an architectural designer and the co-founder of SICK. She holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Syracuse University and is currently pursuing her master's at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where her research lies in the intersection of culture, design technology, and material engineering. Having lived in various parts of the world, away from her hometown of Kuala Lumpur, she is interested in the generic specificity that can be seen in Chinatown as a typology. Welcome, Amelia.
Thank you, Erica. To give you all a sense of the story, China Cloud, I'm going to sandwich a summary with two short excerpts. So here's excerpt 1. C has been with me for the last 5 years. C is anybody and anything I need. But at the same time, C is nobody and nothing. C is the Chinese dream. C is capitalism. C is communism. But most importantly, C is China Cloud. And now I'm going to read a summary written by Jay in the foreword of the anthology. Jay's words read as follows. C for China Cloud centers on a designer tasked with the rebuilding of Chinatown Gate after an all too coincidental accidental fire, raising questions of preservation, identity, the built environment, its relation to the symbolic form, as well as the broad society and city. An interim projected holographic gate takes the place of the physical gate. And here's another excerpt from the short story. In the absence of a physical structure, China Cloud projects a 4-dimensional holographic dragon gate for the time being. It allows passers-by to interact and customize their own version of the gate at that very moment. You could choose your own color and architectural style. There is even a selection of dragons, Fenghuang, Phoenix, Qilin, Chimera, immortal beings, Dogong structures, and color-painted beams for the passers-by to add on. Nothing less enjoyable or self-orientalizing than the boba liberalism that we all grew up with. Nothing less frivolous either. Frivolousness that can be turned off in a flicker. Do we really need palpable artifacts that will once again decay over time to justify our existence? Who is this for anyways? And so the short story does not confine itself to a particular Chinatown, but rather Chinatown as a typology. The transferable context is questioning in and of itself the importance of physicality. Though C is self-referential in everything from Cheese, the main character's home, to the larger China Cloud network, C is at the same time an intangible concept of space and place. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. Next up, we have Evelyn. Evelyn Lamb is an architectural designer who only started visiting Chinatown West after moving downtown and working at a firm located on Spadina Avenue. While her thesis at the University of Waterloo was focused on material flows, her professional and personal work explores a deep interest in community building and the occupation of public space. She often collaborates with the collective Parley to work on small-scale installations and produces studio ceramics in her own time. Welcome, Evelyn.
Thanks, Erica. So this is a shortened version of a story that was written at a time where I was just starting to acknowledge my feelings of unbelonging and trying to put them into words. I also wanted to write a speculative fiction story that spoke about the possibility of joy. It's called Interval. My aunt, family friends whispered, was a disgrace. But here she stood at my elbow, sweetly but earnestly asking the shop owner for a cheaper price. As she turned to leave, she noticed me. Though I had convinced myself that she was too busy, I realized that I had only been holding back the guilty feeling that I didn't want to talk to her, didn't want to get involved. She simply smiled and left the store. I didn't follow. After she left, I felt shame sitting heavy and dense in my stomach. I didn't expect her to wait for me on the street corner, quietly patient. Sorry, I heard myself say when she reached out and took my hand. There were nothing but squat gray apartment blocks in Alexandra Park until I realized, upon closer inspection, that I was stepping on the field of chives. Auntie pulled me forward again, towards an area where the chives appeared to swell as though on the crest of a wave. Closer we moved, half submerged, until the ground dropped out. A square hole, 5 meters by 5 meters, punctured its surface, and a red ladder stood just high enough above its edge to provide sure footing. This time, I followed. In the first sunken courtyard, the sky appeared closer than ever, as though it were painted on the ceiling of this room in the earth. I could hear voices speaking lively, happy, angry conversations, and as I followed Auntie to the next open court, I found a multitude of people trading stories and food, couples linking arms on brightly upholstered benches, and men in undershirts sharing tea. Dialects wove in and out of each other, sometimes 3 different languages to say a single sentence. A man gestures at a pot of soy milk on the counter, ready to be ladled into tiny paper cups. I stop at a stall and try to order. My speech is halting. I am repeating the same few pieces of Cantonese. Though I roll the words around in my mouth to smooth them, when they fall from my lips, they feel jagged and coarse. Auntie has a bowl of water, a small silver paring knife, a single pomegranate. She deftly scores the skin and, gripping the halves with her fingertips, cracks open the fruit. I am shocked by the vivid flesh and the starkness of the rind with the whiteness of grinning teeth. She plucks a single seed from the bloody water and hands it to me. There is a deep crimson spot at the heart, capped with a little peak of snow. I feel as though I'm holding an entire world in my hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. And finally, we have Amy. Amy Yan is a designer and aspiring illustrator currently working in Toronto. She is interested in exploring the intersections between design and storytelling in her work, and in finding new ways to convey a narrative both spatially and visually. Having lived in Toronto her entire life, Amy has many fond childhood memories of time spent with her family in Chinatown East. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Erica. My story, I'll give a quick summary of kind of my thoughts behind the story and then do a quick excerpt. My story is set in 2050, of course, and it's in a post-pandemic world, because back then we all thought it would be a post-pandemic world would be possible. But anyway, I digress. Chinatown, both East and West, have been relocated by the city of Toronto to the Toronto Islands as a way of socially distancing them from the city. And apart from this, the other main idea for the story really came from the history of Chinatowns in San Francisco, where the original neighborhood for the Chinatown community was destroyed by an earthquake and then fires in 1906. And they were able to survive by hiring kind of Western architects to rebuild the area to look very stereotypically Chinese. And it's this kind of self-othering and characterizing that they were able to appeal to a Western audience and thus be able to survive. So when I was writing this story, Toronto's Chinatowns were obviously under question due to the pandemic, and kind of extrapolating from what, the history of Chinatowns in San Francisco, I kind of asked myself what would have to happen for Chinatowns as we know them now to survive the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was imagining, like, what if it's the same, but like kind of done at an even more extravagant or over the top way. And so my story follows this girl who's grown up hearing stories from her mother about the old Chinatowns, East and West, and how it used to be in Toronto. And it follows her first time encountering Chinatown Island, which is the kind of new form of Chinatown, like a theme park, and uncovering a new layer of Chinatown and of herself. And so I'll read a quick excerpt here. So, Mama, I yell when I get home from school the following day, I have a field trip form for you to sign. Mama emerged from her small home office with a sigh. How many times have I asked you to keep your voice down when I'm working, she asked. I could have been in a meeting. Sorry, I said as I swiped the screen of my school tablet in her direction, sending her the form. I wanted to make sure I didn't forget. We're going on a field trip tomorrow, and I need you to sign it so I can go. To Chinatown Island, Mama said, pulling up the form on her watch and reading the hologram display that popped up. Yeah, you've never taken me before. Miss Britton's going to make us write a paragraph on why Chinatown Island is important. I don't think you're ready to go tomorrow, Mama said. But why, I asked. Because you don't know what Chinatown Island is yet, she replied. Yeah, I do. We learned all about it in history class today. I took a deep breath, ready to impress Mama with everything I had learned that day. The pandemic caused all the small shops in the old Chinatowns to go out of business because people weren't allowed to go out and buy anything in person. This caused all the old Chinatowns to close down, and the Chinatown BIA didn't know what to do because there was nobody that could stay open after the pandemic ended. So they got together and decided to create a whole new, awesomer Chinatown on the old Toronto Islands, and they put cooler things in it, like a giant Lucky Cat hotel and a whole bunch of cool carnival rides, so that people could go there whenever they wanted and enjoy the China theme park and drink bubble tea and eat Chinese food and see a super big Chinatown gate replica. So there, I know all about it. So please, can I go tomorrow, Mama? No, said Mama. Oh, just let me go, I cry. No, repeated Mama, that's not what Chinatown Island is. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Thank you, Michael, Amelia, Evelyn, and Amy for sharing your work with us. Our moderator, Biko Mandela Gray, will now offer a response and facilitate a conversation. Biko is Assistant Professor of Religion at Syracuse University. His research and teaching focus on the relationship between Blackness, philosophy of religion, embodiment, and ethics. Along with the many co-authored articles he's written with Linda Zhang, he is the author of the forthcoming book, Black Life Matter, Blackness, Religion, and the Subject, with Duke University Press. Through his work with Linda, Biko has explored the power and promise of Chinatown as a site of and for communal life, as well as political critique. Welcome, Biko.
Thank you all. We typically make the obligatory, it's so good to be here and we're honored. I do have to say that I feel incredibly blessed. Sometimes we say those things, it's just sort of placeholders. These stories are absolutely gorgeous. So for people who are in the audience, if you get a chance to read them, savor over the particular metaphors and the speed and the rhythm of the stories, because they are absolutely gorgeous. I've never heard them out loud, and so I've read them at a different pace. But hearing you all read them with the rhythm and pacing that you have, it's just incredible. So I'm super happy to be here. I'm going to stop rambling now, because if I don't, we'll be here forever. So let's just go ahead and get on into this. I'm stuck in a rut, oscillating between eureka and frustration. This is one of the lines from one of the stories. As I read these stories, I couldn't help thinking, I feel you. These stories do not let you land. They resist resolution. They do not offer easy answers. But that's the thing about stories, or at least that's the thing about these stories. They take us places. They open temporal, spatial, and sensory worlds. See and smell roasted pork in the windows of a vendor's store on Chinatown Island, and you might realize how much you do or do not belong. China Cloud will call you into question, even as it is the very portal through which you come to know yourself and others. An undone biometric chore will take you underground to that place where the forgotten still remember. Ride in your Tesla Cybertruck to New Hong Fat's barbecue, and you'll wonder about the meaning of home. These stories do different things, but as I read them, they also share a profound similarity. Amidst hypersonic travel and pomegranate seeds, amidst Lucky Cat hotels and Google campuses, these stories highlight the difference between space and place, or what we would call space and place. Space, after all, gridlocks and categorizes. It pins things, people, communities, into specific positions. But as Toni Morrison tells us, a place, the picture of it, that stays. Place is felt. Place is smelled, heard, tasted, touched, seen, remembered, and forgotten. Place is contested. Touches from aunties can invite or shun. Field trips can excite and render pain in a matter of seconds. Home is tasted and mythologized. China is as much in the cloud or the clouds as it is on the ground. Place, these essays remind us, does not sit still. that is always contested, negotiated, cultivated in relation to and with others. In these stories, Chinatown is a place, not a space. Mimi's mama is unimpressed by the theme park that is Chinatown Island, but she remembers Lung's food. Yehanala Shi feels a responsibility to do right by her ancestors and her community in redesigning that fallen gate. Matt still stops by the now thrice owned New Hong Fat's barbecue, and Auntie's underground community interrupts the banal intervals of everyday life. These stories do not take us to spaces. They negotiate place. They find, announce, sustain, or destroy meanings. To read these stories is to challenge and be challenged by our ideas of what and where Chinatown, which is to say what and where place, could and would be. And these challenges open questions. These are questions I want to pose to the authors. For Amy, I wonder, is Chinatown, by its very definition, always already a theme park? Which is to ask, is the China in Chinatown a theme or mere theme? For Michael, does Chinatown remain when Google comes? And how is Google different from New Hong Fat Barbecue's new ownership, especially when you are the new owner? For Amelia, what does it mean to quote unquote be community when Chinatown is as much in the cloud, as it is a geographical location? And for Evelyn, where do we find community when a forgotten, which is to say, when the discarded and discardable auntie can offer us an entire world in an underground pomegranate seed? What is the relationship between community, place, and dispossession? I ask that one more time so y'all can sort of marinate on it. What is the relationship between community, place, and dispossession? That last question is, of course, for all of you. And I do not ask these questions expecting easy answers. In fact, I do not ask them to receive answers at all. I ask them as a way to open conversation. After all, these stories take us in different directions. They show us how place is singular in its plurality. They remind us that Chinatown is always more and perhaps less than its design, that it resides in the smells, tastes, touches, sounds, memories, experiences, and forgettings that Dragon Gates and Lucky Cat statues or hotels can occasion for us. These stories tell us that Chinatown, more than anything else, maybe, is a place, that Chinatown is place, and that it cannot be contained. After reading these stories, I wouldn't dare tell you what Chinatown is, but I wouldn't tell you what it isn't either. I'm stuck in a rut, oscillating between eureka and frustration, she tells us. And I think to myself, maybe that oscillation is what makes place possible. So that's my reflection on what you all have done. I am looking so forward to having this conversation, and I want to open up with the questions that I gave you all. And so if you all want me to reread them, I can, but I'm sure you all have some thoughts, and so I will open it up. Linda, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself too, so that we're all on the same page here? But if you all don't want to take that massive question, what is the relationship between community, place, and dispossession? You don't want to take that one. I've asked you all individual ones, and so I would love to hear your responses to those to get us started. Y'all are like, I don't know. Who goes first?
These are hard questions, Vika.
Go ahead. I'm listening to y'all though. They are really questions that I just wanted to open up with. But yeah, I mean, perhaps one way to think about this then is if we can go and we can come at this another way. Maybe I'm interested. Maybe I'll go at it this way. I'll start with Mike. I'm interested in the Tesla Cybertruck. This detail is like, and I know, of course, like, ooh, it's like, all right, like, yeah, and we all know the Cybertruck, I don't think is out yet, right? I think it's still like a bad concept. No shade to the, but my point in all of this is what is the importance of that? I see a connection between that and Google campuses, and somehow this discussion of home that is lost.
Yeah, I,
Yeah, so I'd love to hear more about that to get us started.
I think that's, yeah, definitely interesting. I think maybe the brings us back to like the context of the story being in like what is it, early 2020, and I think there was sort of a meme or some sort of like joke where at the time Musk was like demoing, had just like released this idea of the Tesla Cybertruck, and as part of the demo had like thrown a baseball or something at the window, and it had like gone right through the windshield. And so that there was sort of like a small sort of inside joke, but then sort of like taking the truck sort of serves multiple roles. That's sort of a foreshadowing of this idea that like Matt is driving this truck um, because he owns the restaurant, right, as a business expense, and he uses it to transport food or like equipment to the restaurant, and also being able to like from my experience growing up of like traveling to Chinatown from the suburbs was very much one of like driving driving there rather than like taking transit or walking. So I think that like the truck serves that role to be able to sort of reflect on sort of that path of starting around like King Street and sort of illegally driving through one of the left no straight through intersections of the King Street pilot project to sort of working your way up Spadina to Chinatown.
I appreciate that. I was thinking about it. I was definitely thinking about the inside joke. Not gonna lie to you. I was also thinking about the yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I shouldn't say this, maybe we're being recorded, but I would say I take great pleasure in making fun of Elon Musk for multiple reasons. But my point in all of this is that at the end of the day, I also found it super, super, super interesting that you have this, and I'm not sure how this is working, but it seems to me that there's a connection between the Tesla Cybertruck and Google, this sort of like massive colonialist project that is Google that sort of comes in. And I'm wondering, was that intentional, or was that, how do we negotiate Chinatown space when it's literally being gobbled up, or in many ways being overtaken by what we think of progress?
And again, I think that's maybe another Toronto inside joke. There was at the time sort of early Google was attempting to sort of like set up their Sidewalk, or Alphabet, I suppose, sort of the sister as a sister company to Google, set up the Sidewalk Labs project on waterfront Toronto, and sort of this was sort of a reflection on that, sort of transplanted to Chinatown. But sort of like maybe to take it back to the original question of like, does Chinatown remain when sort of Google comes? And I think it's pretty clear, and sort of through the excerpts from the story of like the Chinatown that Matt is familiar with and that Matt's family is familiar with is sort of being replaced by this corporate version of the like with chefs thrown in from Beijing that sort of like has the image of Chinatown, but is like not familiar to Matt and his family. It doesn't have the grocery stores where they go to shop. It doesn't have the restaurants where they go to eat. But I guess Chinatown is sort of still there, and I think that this is maybe as a theme to tie the other authors' pieces in, is in this sort of like I guess like a ghost Chinatown or a wizard Chinatown, in the sense that it's like hidden by an invisibility charm, and sort of like reflecting on from Jeremy's words in the intro, is only there for those who know where to look. And I guess, yeah, like thinking about Evelyn in your story, the underground Chinatown that's hidden by in the field of chives, or Amy in your story, the Chinatown vendors meeting that occurs only after the tourists on the island have left, or Amelia in your story, the holographic gate that sort of flickers with images of people's Chinatowns as they walk by it, sort of this idea of the ghost Chinatown.
Amelia, I saw you nodding a lot. I wonder if you wanna share what's going on in your mind right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think with like ghosts and kind of this opacity or flickering, it really alludes to not a singular answer, right? Having that plurality, especially I think it's hard to, in this kind of, with your question, Biko, how does community place and disposition relate to each other? I think it's in that loss, we all have our own idea of the Chinatown that we are nostalgic to.
That's good.
And then how do we consolidate that, if productive at all, to have that consolidation to its this idealized form. But I think it's like this triangle that you painted in your question: community, place, and loss. But perhaps like in the loss, then there's a fostering of a greater community. And with community, then anywhere really could be place, or at least that's how like China Cloud was kind of seeing, like, right, like this cloud, nebulous cloud community. What does that mean? So also, like, you had one line in your reading of it. You were like, place can be smelled, heard, tasted, but then in the cloud, like, maybe how do you do that, like virtually, or we have transcended that senses, perhaps. But you know, going beyond like this geographical location of Chinatown, really China Cloud was inspired by subtle Asian traits. Perhaps many of you are familiar with that. It's this Facebook online group where it's this diaspora community, and all they like, it's like one of the largest diaspora community now, and like people bond because of memes, behavioral traits, like this nebulous, nostalgic allusions to others' examples. But really, everyone's just everywhere in the world, and I think that's really what China Cloud is inspired by. And then with the diaspora community, right, like again, there's no singularity, always flickering between, am I Chinese enough, or am I Canadian enough, or whatever your host nationality is, right? I don't know. Yeah, I don't think it's hard to answer your question. How is it?
I think you answered it beautifully. To be honest with you, I'm not even like, and I'm not even gassing you up just because we're on the screen. I think at the end of the day, like that is. I mean, I don't mean to like to think like kind of like put my little thoughts on the page, but there's something haunting about that gate for me. This is the one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading and rereading your story, is that it seems to me that the protagonist just kind of throws their hands up in resignation at the end. I was trying to design something physical, forget it. Like space might actually have to, when Chinatown has been haunted and hollowed out and moved up into the clouds, maybe the best move is to allow each and every person to project onto this gate what they think it is. And so there's something beautifully haunting, and yet at the same time something deeply communal forming in the way that you framed it. I think you answered. Yeah, I think that answers. I'm here for it. I'm thinking. I'm trying like to keep myself out of this, but I'm also thinking a lot with a lot of things that that you all are saying. I do want to take a brief break before I do this. If you all have questions, there's a Q&A for the people who are like attendees. There's a Q&A function. You can always use that. And Reese, shout out to Reese. Reese has figured out the chat function already. So if you want to put things in the chat as well, definitely go ahead and put that in there. Maybe you don't have a question, maybe you have a comment, maybe you have an idea, maybe you have a reaction. You can always put that in the comments as well. And you can that way you all can go ahead and become part of this conversation as well. So I just want to invite everyone in as we continue this wonderful conversation. Amy, I'm coming to you because I ain't gonna lie, I read that passage that you read out loud much more slowly, right? And so, and I like in my mind, I read it much more slowly. And the beautiful thing that you did was you read it how a kid would read it. So I was thinking of it in terms of like oh, like this is a series of interrogations of like a kid who's like, I'm ready to go tomorrow, right? Like we're gonna go have a blast. But then when you sped it up in the reading, you did this beautiful thing of articulating a child's almost naive excitement about the newness. And I just wanted to say up front that it was beautiful. Like I just gotta announce that. But with that though, I think I might have asked you a really hard question, but I really have been thinking about this one, and I think your story does this. Like, and I don't want this to come off negatively, but the way Chinatown Island is set up, it's a trope, right? It's a kind of um, it's an attraction, right? Minus Lung's barbecue spot, and so now I'm wondering, like, how do we think about space when when a community's culture and heritage has been turned into a commodifiable trope? That's where my question was coming from for you. Is Chinatown, or is the China in Chinatown nothing more than a theme for a theme park? I'm wondering what you think. Because I know the protagonist, like Mimi's like, oh, like she realized with the crazy, I shouldn't say this, but with the white kids who are like, ooh, that's nasty, right? We recognize that they have an issue, but I'm interested in, how do you think about this as authoring this particular story?
Yeah, yeah. So I really appreciated your question when I first read it, because I was like, it made me kind of reconsider how I had thought of the story, and yeah, it made me kind of question how Chinatown is kind of portrayed in my story. And I think in coming up with my kind of response to that, I think what came to mind mostly was the idea that Chinatown is multivalent. And it at once kind of embodies the notion that it's a theme park, while also radically kind of expanding or negating that definition. And so I think on the surface, in the China in Chinatown can always be viewed as a mere theme. Like thinking back to like the inception of like the first Chinatowns in San Francisco, the Chineseness was applied in a way to make it appeal to Western audiences. It was a theme. And it was this kind of fake facade that was kind of put up. And they very casually borrowed from Chinese architecture and style. And I think this identity of Chinatown, as you mentioned, certainly exists in the story. Mimi, who's like the child and very excited about this theme park, she hasn't had any experiences of Chinatown in her life. She's only really heard of it, and so she of course really only sees this veneer. But then on the other hand, her mom, who's experienced Chinatown before, has kind of memories of living in it and belonging to that Chinatown community, and knows that that identity of Chinatown is so much more than just a theme. And so actually kind of a side note, because like I was thinking a lot about memories when I was like reviewing all our stories. And I think actually one theme that we all have in our stories is this kind of idea of memory, and like looking back on what Chinatown was and what Chinatown is. And I think that those memories are actually what make Chinatown more than a theme. And so I actually was like, I kind of rationalized it to the point where like, what if, because this book is so full of those memories, like what if this book is just Chinatown? And then I just kind of blew my own mind. But anyway, but back to your question, like at the beginning of Chinatown Island, Mama is kind of her, like the character's mom is kind of mourning the real identity of Chinatown, because, you know, she's kind of like Mimi, just seeing the surface, like the veneer. But as the story progresses, it kind of peel back the layers. And so then the Chinatown can kind of expand beyond just a theme.
It also seems, to be honest with you, that you're also pushing, there's a resonance in all of these stories, that you all are also so deeply expanding how we understand place as a meaning. That was what I was trying to get at in my reflections, is that like, I mean, I know we're dealing with, you know, like design schools, so I guess we should probably, but my point in all of this is that there's something to be said for the fact that you all are so expanding how we might even begin to think about design in relation to community, in relation to lost memories, in relation to a theme that can no longer be a theme. So I'm just riffing off of you, Amy, because I loved it. Yeah, it was, I mean, these stories were gorgeous. And so I'm going to tell you, so I'm going to transition really quickly, and then we got to open up to the audience and everything. And I want to hear from like people. So, Evelyn, this pomegranate seed, my God, I was reading this, and it was the one thing that I could not shake, that the world is in a pomegranate seed. And and so I have to ask you, I mean, my question honestly came from, if I read the story correctly, this person like dropped the chore, right? They were supposed to get something done and they hadn't gotten it done. Now they can't, now they got to go outside and actually buy real food because it don't get delivered no more, right? But then she ends up with her auntie who she doesn't like, right? Who she loves, but is shunned from the community because she's, for lack of a better word, too real. And I just wanted you just to meditate a little bit on, it is this question of memory, Amy. What do we do? How do we think about community in relation to the forgotten who remember? I know that's a hard question to ask. I know it is, but it seems to me that the protagonist of the story is not at all is unfamiliar with the tartness and sweetness of a pomegranate seed.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you could riff off of that, go ahead.
I think for me, it is, I think that the thing about writing, given that like I haven't done a lot of it, is that people do really kind of grab onto things that I didn't expect them to like so much. So with the pomegranate seed, I think when I wrote it, I was like, oh man, this is like kind of cliche, because I was thinking about like Hades and Persephone and how she's tricked into eating a pomegranate seed. And this is kind of like a reverse spring where like spring is actually underground. And I think I kind of wrote it being like, okay, this is kind of where I see it going. And I kind of didn't expect it to really tie everything together in such a fashion. And I think if I'm also similar to everyone else, gonna kind of circle back to your initial question, which is about like people who are seen as discarded or discardable within society, especially in one that's becoming more and more like appearance-based, let's say, which I think appears both in all of our stories with like the neighborhood itself being sanitized and having sort of like a facade in front of it. And then one that's more real and a little bit uncomfortable behind, which I would argue is where you actually find community. It's like a safe space where you're allowed to be uncomfortable and show discomfort because there's no fear of that ostracization. So with that, I think that I started working with sort of this notion that there can be like a haven where people, I think in some ways, and I can't speak for everyone here, but living between two cultures, I think you feel nostalgia for things that you haven't necessarily experienced yourself, but which people tell you about or you've watched movies about. And so I think with this protagonist, having never tasted pomegranate before or even kind of seen food in real life, there's an idea that there is a connection through it because of her auntie, someone who she's never given a lot of thought to. And I think that the part that I love most about reading all of our stories in unison, like one after the other, is that you do get that kind of peeling back of the initial glossy layer of Chinatown and then seeing sort of something raw or kind of less perfect underneath.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No. I'm literally just like, I love that idea of having nostalgia for something that you didn't remember. I'm gonna like, I'm making sure we don't have any like anything in the chat really quick. I'm gonna read you a line that Evelyn, I'm gonna stay with you for just 1 second. And this was the line that I think like kind of like messed me up. Thank goodness they cleaned up those streets. It was so dirty.
Yeah, I think
and the mother says this, right? It's not actually, it's not the protagonist who says this, right? Is that right?
Yeah. And I think even writing that line, I think, you always kind of read things over a little while back and you wish that you did maybe the story a little bit more justice. But I think that line was one that I was very happy with how kind of like it hit me, because I think that even in Amy's story, you kind of get that like initial kind of factor from sort of like a Western perspective about a lot of things that are really near and dear to the hearts of like Chinese culture or any kind of Asian culture that works with food or in a different way, right? And so with that, I think I was really trying to parse through sort of like that us versus them mentality that Linda even spoke about really early on, that anti-Asian sentiment with the idea that like it's dirty, it's disease, that kind of thing. And I think I was trying to wonder how much of that really like seeps into us as like porous people living in this kind of world where if you're told so often that your neighborhood is dirty, how much of that do you internalize? And especially being as someone who visited Chinatown much later in life and like really living in the suburbs, I think I struggled with that perception because that was a narrative that was being told to me for so long. And it was really only after spending time there and getting to know people and experiencing the lifestyle that I could really kind of engage with it and see beyond that perception.
I thought it. I really appreciate. I mean, I'm trying my best to sort of again restrain. I have other questions that I was going to ask, but Linda, I wanted you to get on in here real quick before I started. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think like also just like also for the audience, like for anyone who's not as familiar with Chinatown, like I think this notion of like it's dirty and it needs to be cleaned up, which we saw a lot with COVID and who stopped going to Chinatown first. And even, I mean, we've had conversations in this room around how that was also internalized within our own community and our own families. Even though probably at that, honestly, when COVID first arrived here, Chinatown was probably the cleanest place because they were the ones who knew what was up. But in the context of like Toronto, you know, like it was interesting when we were doing archival work in the Toronto City Archives, the thing that you will actually find the most documentation on for Chinatown East here, like the materials that you find the most of is about all of the back and forth with the city around garbage and garbage removal issues and changing all of the policies around garbage collection on Gerrard Street. Like that's like, there's so much paperwork on that and there's like nothing about any of the architecture or the heritage, or like there's no drawing of, you know, Bright Pearl. It's just all garbage, everything about garbage, because like that's the issue. And it's not just like external to Chinatown, right? I think we have this then also like within the community, there are folks who would really love to see Chinatown West have, I don't know how they describe it, but just, you know, have more revenue or income flowing into the community that could help revitalize it. And there's sort of all these different sentiments and they play out, I think, in a lot of different ways. And design is also not excused from these themes or questions, or how we think about making a space, if a space allows for the messiness of life, or if it kind of cleans up a space, or if it kind of packages it then like neatly afterwards. And I think one of the themes that emerged also through this, actually, I think this came up as a result of writing the anthology and in the discussions of the forward and afterward. One of the things that kind of became apparent was this idea that, you know, Chinatown really only exists already as an act of resistance against being displaced. Like it's born out of displacement and trying to resist that. And that resistance is often done in ways that are strategic, that produces the sort of mirror theming. But as, you know, in the sense of like how we make place and how we build place as architects and as designers, you know, what does that resistance look like? Because who are most of our clients as architects in this room, in particular for, you know, students of architecture, who are you going to go work for when you graduate? You're likely working for the developers that are going to displace this very community. If you're building in Chinatown, who's your client? It's not like, is the community going to pay you to be able to build the Chinatown that they want in the future? like your client is probably the developer who was displacing this. And so, and then if we're thinking about Chinatown heritage, like if the only, there's a lot of conversations around Chinatown as a cultural district right now. So if you know, say Chinatown becomes a cultural district, what is being preserved within that? How does the messiness of all of this come into that conversation? And I think that ties back to a lot of the themes that you've all just talked about, kind of the expansion of Chinatown as a place in many ways. And to me, that resistance that Chinatown is born of is a resistance where it says, you know, this is what was allowed to exist here. This is what was allowed to be called Canadian heritage, to be a place that exists in Canada. And actually, it is too narrow and we need to expand. This is what heritage is, and as architecture. But Chinatown says, no, actually, there is more to architectural heritage in Canada, in the US, wherever, than what we currently deem, and there's more here. And there's all these forms in which I think that expansion is the resistance. It's, you know, this is part of, Chinatown is part of the city of Toronto. It is part of life here. It is part of being Canadian here, is part of being Toronto here. All of these messy things do have a way into these spaces. Yeah.
I'm just thinking through all of the sort of the hard ethical questions that you're putting to us in terms of being, or putting to folks who are designers. I can't design my way out of a paper bag, but for people who are thinking through these questions, like what does it mean what is the ethical positionality for someone when you are asked to do something that might displace the very community that you and to think about, Linda, you always do it. Go ahead.
Amelia, in your story, right, we kind of end with, we throw our hands up in the air, we don't know what to do physically. But then also there's no actual, there's a kind of irresolution because the virtual, like China Cloud disappears also, the virtual disappears as well. There is no good way to move forward. And I think that irresolution is kind of the point. If you want to share any thoughts that you might have.
Yeah, I mean, it's always that dilemma. How do you preserve that messiness, but also stay sanitary, right? How do you design and develop, but also kind of stay true, whatever that means? And like, if you are preserving, really, whose voice are you freezing in time, right? That's why, like, it's constantly evolving, like this expansion as a form of resistance. But then, like, how do we design then for our community so that it could be economically revitalized, right? Like, so that is that in the form of, say, doing pro bono design work? Like just simple change, would that like up your business and in like the storefront? Like, how do you clean up this? How do we stay sanitary without whitewashing, but you know, without the aesthetics that we have been colonized by? Is that just merely thinking about color, texture, ornamentation, and staying true to that, or then that becomes like an applique stylistic application, then that kind of defeats the point. Really no real answers. So that's why I think like in the context of China Clouds, it like the main character, she raises his hands, and I
think the question of power that you're raising is it's a really difficult one. I think there are, if in our ethical code of conduct as architects, right, we are supposed to do good, serve the public, do public good. And yet I think somehow Chinatown is an example where actually how our profession works, how we are contracted to be able to build, how we interface with city, community, people, just funds to be able to like commission a work is failing. And like, I think like do we all need to do pro bono work? Or like, is there another structure of how architecture as work should be happening that should be our ethical code of conduct? Chinatown is calling for the expansion of that because what is happening is not working. If this continues, Chinatown will be gentrified to the point where it is just Chinese and Asian franchises and there is no community here, right? So where is kind of that balance? And it makes me think a lot, Mike, about your story in which you actually have someone who is not the first gen store owner, but you have someone who has enough capital and power to actually buy and become a business owner and kind of like take on the next generation for this like Hong Fat BBQ. But at the same time, there's the story is talking about all the criticisms of it's changing and the new owner and it's not as good. And like, of course, every change seems to be critiqued, but nothing at the same time can stay the same. And there is some glimmers of amounts of community power where there are certain things that are in control, and yet they receive so much critique from the community as well. So how does that kind of all come together? Yeah, over to you.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up with Linda, like on architecture and Chinatown. But it's just one line. Perhaps the way towards it's we move away from architecture as hero and architect as facilitator. So really like when we work with when one works with developers and things like that, you're really on this gestural grand move kind of thing. But like even in this form, we're working through speculative stories or stories of the communities, it's really the model of architect as facilitator. Oh, sorry, Mike, please go on.
No. Yeah. Thinking about sort of the ownership change of New Hong Fat, I guess, and in the same way, and I think Amy sort of hinted at this, the sort of multivalence and sort of this balance between sort of like othering and belonging. And I think that there's sort of like an act of resistance or an act of refusal in Matt's like purchasing of the New Hong Fat, and that he sort of, or maybe in writing that in the way that I wrote that, it's sort of like trying to claim New Hong Fat and like this aspect of Chinatown and the part of Chinatown that's meaningful to me as sort of like my own, and whether or not, and I think that there is like a double-edgedness to that, right? It's both that it's an act of expansion and an act of sort of emergence, but I think it's also this question of like, who is it for? Maybe, or I think Linda, you sort of brought up this idea in some of the talks around that time of the White City and the Chicago World's Fair, and this like road that was sort of like in order of whiteness, right? Like, and sort of the Chinatown part of that city was somewhere along that road. And I think that like in our struggle maybe to like progress along the road towards the White City, this act of refusal is applied as much to like within the Chinatown community as much as like to protect ourselves and to sort of emerge and to grow.
I just want to give a little bit of context to those in the audience. So the White City is the Chicago's exposition, which I might get the date wrong. It was around 1893. And this was one of the first instances of like architecture built by Chinese Americans at the time. I say Chinese because at the time it wasn't Pan-Asian community yet. And this is like a World's Fair where like usually each of the pavilions is funded by the country that they represent. But of course, due to the Chinese Exclusion Act that came through, I believe, 1892, the Qing government decided to not participate and boycott the World's Fair. And so the Chinese that were already in America and in Chicago at the time, that was a huge issue because this was seen as a moment where there could be like race mediations, like where like, we could build this pavilion to try to literally like fight for our rights and try to like, establish a better relationship to European Americans at the time. And so the Chicago World Exposition, its architecture is nicknamed the White City for its uniform, neat buildings, uniform style, height, size, and the color was all white, of course. And in this, all of the pavilions from other kind of countries didn't fit in the White City. So they had this thing called the Midway, which is this one road. And as Mike, you mentioned, it's literally organized from black to white. It is everything that doesn't fit, and everything's a carnival and it's consumed in that way. This was like one of the first pieces of Chinese American architecture that was built to represent, and it was built for the purpose of trying to establish being allowed to occupy space in America, which is as a form of resistance, which is then what inspires Chinatown as we continue on into that kind of negotiation. It's part of the context of a lot of the intangible themes of these stories, but it's also very much the built form of all of our cities and Chinatown today. And I think also just going back to Amelia, some of your comments around like losing the idea of like, not losing, but moving beyond the idea of like architect as like hero, singular, genius designer, and towards the notion of facilitator. Like I think an interesting piece that comes out in that is I think a lot of the time in these kinds of sites or sites from like marginalized communities, people will kind of sort of like, there's like a cop out, which is to say, oh, it's a vernacular, let's just study what is there. It's so fascinating. And like, these things are happening and they happen without architects, and the community can do it on their own, which I think, yes, that is true. And there's so much that we can learn from. At the same time, I don't think it's to say that we can free ourselves in this profession of architecture from any responsibility towards direct actions that we should be doing. And we do actually have skills that would be incredibly valuable and useful to actually partake in some of these forms of resistance that community members don't have access to if they don't have access to our fancy design educations and design softwares. And so the role of that facilitator, I think, is really important, where you are you're facilitating, you're essentially helping other people realize their vision instead of imposing yours on others.
I'm just thinking of this line. I'm oscillating. I'm stuck in a rut, oscillating between eureka and frustration. I mean, this is the line that comes from sort of Amelia's story, and I think that is there's something profoundly unsettling about all of these stories in that way, right? That they destabilize us. I mean, and I've given all these. They're different lines that show up in different ways. Mimi's mama is like, look, girl, like I don't know how to tell you this. Like Chinatown Island is not what you think it is, and no matter and Mimi cannot be swayed until the presumably white kids see what's hanging in the window, which in certain ways is a bad business decision made by the restaurant owner. That's unsanitary. And so this moment of recognition for Mimi, I think for me, that's the moment where I was profoundly unsettled in that story. And so I'm listening to you all, and there's a Q&A. So Frank, we're going to get to you in just one second, but there's just this moment. There are these moments in each one of those stories where I found myself profoundly unsettled. I'm a Black American dude, and yet I found myself resonating deeply with, thank God they cleaned those streets up. Why did I find myself thinking that? Because this is precisely how we may not say that out loud when it comes to certain modalities of Black communities, but that's what we mean when we say I'll sleep when I die. That I will replicate a certain normative approach. And yet, so all of you all, but then how do you preserve? I love the way Reese puts it. How do you acknowledge the past, which is to say, acknowledge who and what you are while adapting to a future that in many ways is just And I don't know, I think this idea of architect as facilitator is, I think that's one way of thinking about it. How does one in many ways unsettle their own authority in relation to the communities that they want to be in conversation with? Right. And I don't, yeah, I'm just so deeply just moved by that because I feel it. I keep thinking the term that keeps coming to me is haunting. We are both haunted, and we are both haunted by and haunting normative worlds, normative spaces, normative interpretations of places. I mean, that White City piece, Linda, we're gonna be talking about that later. I'm just gonna let you know we're gonna have a conversation. Yeah, because we're gonna figure that part out because there's something there. I want us to transition. So Frank Young asked this question to Michael. 2050 would be a speculative, fictional, ecological, catastrophic year for me, with climate crisis and zoonotic transhuman swine flu virus. What a hopeful and inspiring vision, Frank. Not gonna lie to you, this is exciting. I'm playing with you, Frank. I don't mean it in a negative way. Is a quote unquote Beyond Meat version of New Hong Fat Barbecue still palatable to you?
That's a great question, Frank. At first sound, I think I'm skeptical, but I think maybe with enough experimentation, I'm open to the idea. I guess, yeah, thinking about the food aspect of it, I think sort of like the food is a common theme throughout each of the stories, right? I think it connecting to Evelyn, your story, like this idea of the pomegranate being the fulcrum between sort of between generations, right? It's like between the auntie and the protagonist, and sort of like thinking about whether the idea of this Beyond Meat. I think what it does, it loses its power. And I think this is something maybe we reflected on of sense of like smell and taste. And I think there's like a biological function of like, and the rituals around food that like transport us across like between nations and between generations, between like time and space. And I think that like thinking about like the I guess the Chinese diaspora and food is like an important role in being that joint, that like point of articulation between that sort of like connects us and brings us together. And I think that like, yeah, it's very much, I'm sure it's very much true across other diasporas, but is especially true to me in Chinatown, and like comes to light in each of these stories.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer this question. I think you answered it beautifully, Mike. I'm not going to get in the middle of like specifics of stories. What came to mind is the diasporic notion of an underground community. And Evelyn, I'm just going to come back to you just briefly, and just it seemed to me, and you can answer. You can say, "Oh no, I didn't mean it this way," but it seemed to me that there was something like a life down there. And I'm using those words like that there was something like a life underground.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so this I'm wondering, are you wanting us to sit in the space between joy and sorrow in that underground space when they're playing because there is a life, there's something, and yet the protagonist snatches her hand back when Auntie tries. So I'm wondering, are you trying to not as, I guess is the sad way to say it, or the sort of cliche, is this a happy ending story? Or what do we make of that something like a life that is built?
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks exactly to the quote that, and I like that you repeat it, because I think it does that oscillation between eureka and frustration. It's like in that rut, it doesn't really end anywhere, because I think that the difficulty of trying to engage with sort of a culture that you don't quite remember is that it is going to be difficult to do, because it's not what kind of you grew up valuing. And I think that, I don't know if people can tell, but I definitely had the most fun writing the passages about sort of like the vegetables underground and how they smell, how like fish sauce, speaking about all of that. I think as someone who I think very similar to everyone here and what Mike said, food is very near and dear, especially with my mom cooking so much and having sort of the process be inherently messy. I think that what I liked as well is that in a lot of these stories, we're in the sanitized version of Chinatown, food is so like divorced from this kind of messy process. And I'm just going to say, I tried one of those like box prep things recently where they send you packages, and I did not like it because it was so kind of like packaged and processed, even though it was raw ingredients. And I think that very similar to what Mike said, there is a joy in being messy with the food that you consume and the food that you make for others. And so I think I feel very strongly about that. And I hope that comes through, at least in my story and other ones, where there's a really clear difference between the delivered, like the drone delivered packages versus what you grow and see yourself.
There's something completely different about a recipe that comes in a box, and where I come from, we eat something called gumbo. My father's been trying to teach me how to make this for years, and it's my only correlate here is that I was like, "Pops, you got a recipe for me?" He was like, "No, I do not. You know when it's ready. When it's
yeah,
ready."
you go with feeling.
And that's that sort of that's that messiness, right? That's that like. You know what I mean? So it's that kind of like, and this is what we see happening with Mimi in Chinatown Island, I think in a certain way, is that Mimi is like, no, I know that. And I know that's good. And then here come these crazy kids who are our friends, right? Who are buddies, but all of a sudden are not our friends. And so there's something about that messiness that you know when you see it. Oh, that joint about to be fire. Like do you understand? Like, and so there's something about that. I want to hear more. I want to hear more from you, Amy, in terms of like that messiness, because I hear in these stories this sort of like this pushing toward, not pushing toward, but not refusing to get rid of the mess. And total aside, Linda and I have been thinking in design ways on how to think in that messy place. And I'll be done after that. Go ahead, Amy. Holla at us real quick.
Yeah, I think that messy kind of, well, I guess I'll speak to the moment that you were talking about, Biko, which is when the main character is looking in a shop window and kind of sees something that she's used to eating, just like a roast pig, and her friends are kind of like, what is that? And she feels very like out of place. I was drawing a lot from, I guess, personal experience for that. And I think why it's so important to me is because it's like, there's so many memories attached to the food. And I think, as all of us have, said that like food is this very important part of our culture. And it's very emotional. And so I think, I guess, even though it's like, well, the character feels like it's put on display, but like, even though she feels that way, she feels like still very attached to it. And so it's, it's just kind of playing with those emotions around food. But
playing with those those sort of complicated emotions around the food too, right? The shame and the joy. She's excited and tries to explain it if I remember correctly, tries to explain it to her buddies. Mm-hmm. It might have been skipping rope together, whatever it is that they do, in the recess field. But then you turn around and like all of a sudden they're like, no. And then she feels shame. And that was the one thing that was the one thing that unsettled me about that story, is the shame that creeps in at the joy she feels in seeing the food, like how complicated. I mean, that's how Chinatown sort of is complicated and messy and bigger and more and less than these sort of troped understandings of of place. So I'm just totally there with you. We've got another Q&A. This one is straight up like strong architecture. It comes from, forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Chin Shi Kai. How do you, I think this is for anyone who wants to answer. How do you think participatory design in architecture and urbanism can facilitate the community to reimagine their Chinatown? I ask you again, how do you, go ahead. Oh, y'all got it?
I was going to do a plug because there's another event happening tomorrow where I will actually be speaking on a version of this that I have been thinking through. So I invite you all to join back tomorrow. But in terms of, I think in the context of these stories as well, it's like I actually think that like as our like part of this emerged in a long conversation where we're trying to think about like how do we build here, where do we start as architects who have a skill set to and knowledge that we can try to share to want to contribute to making spaces for community in Chinatown? Where do we start? And there wasn't really an answer when we looked in the present. And I think that's why we got here, why we started thinking about 2050 was a way to kind of open up a conversation where we think about larger questions, about things further into the future, about just breaking away from some of the immediate tangible things to be able to come back. And I think in doing so, and like I think you've heard some of it in this conversation as well, a lot of things emerged that were really difficult conversations in terms of the messiness of the irresolution, but led to some, not necessarily clarity, but like understanding of ways in which we might have pathways or forms of power building to move forward and take into it. And so I think kind of coming out of this project, but also even just this conversation, I think one of the themes that I think we come back to is like, what's the authority of the architect in Chinatown for being able to foster any of this kind of placemaking, and where is power, who holds power? And in that question, I think is also coming back to that question of loss. Like, I think if we want to gain something in terms of community power in Chinatown, and we want, as architects, want to contribute to that future, we also have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to lose within the profession? Because you can't gain anything without losing something. Like, something has to change in how we are moving forward and how we've been doing things, and what are we as designers kind of willing to lose in order to be able to actually do some of that work. Oh, I see. Yes, in the chat is the description for the event tomorrow, in case you want to hear more about sort of another project of mine related to Chinatown, which came out of and was very inspired by a lot of the conversations here, that is doing what we call co-design rather than participatory design. It's a little bit more active, we hope, in Chinatown West right now.
Thank you
We'd
for
like
that,
to-
Linda. Oh, I was just going to transition it over to
Oh.
Dean Du. I think.
Oh,
Dean,
perfect. Go ahead then.
yeah, I think Dean Du has a couple of things that she would like to say. So it is on you, Dean. Thank you for having us here.
Thank you, Biko. I mean, I have to say that your words were, you have done such a wonderful job moderating. I'm thinking to invite you back to moderate for every single one, including tomorrow. Are you free between 10 and 1 tomorrow? I'm going to continue to plug this. So I co-organized a symposium that is going to be tomorrow with Anna Robo, and we have invited 9 designers, practitioners, activists from around the world, from Ghana to South Africa to Mumbai, Toronto, everywhere, to understand the different roles that design and architecture can contribute to many of the issues that's been discussing today, specifically to the issue of working that is community oriented, that is about building capacity, that is about participatory or co-design, that is not only about designing form, but also designing policy, designing relationships, and also revealing the deeply embedded issues that sometimes the designers are able to do. So I also, I have listened to the whole symposium and this whole panel as well, and I found I felt a little bit heartbroken because some of the questions about talking about the limitations of the practice of architecture, like Amelia, I could see the pain in your face. There's like, well, is there something, can we sanitize it, but also still keep its character? Like, what can architects do? So I would say, number one, I hope if those are your interested, come to see some of the inspirational stories of practitioners. And when I say practitioners, that means policy, design, everything, right, tomorrow. But second, I would say that I think that architecture has the power to be practiced in many forms. So, from design of buildings to the design of space. And I actually, for this particular panel, I want to say that architecture also has a role to inspire and enable words. So I wanted to be able to just contribute to my appreciation to this project and everyone's contribution, because I have found, struggling to write myself for over a decade, is that one of the reasons I have struggled to write with the language of which that could be understood by anyone, not only architects, not only academics, not only who's from a particular cultural context, is I have found that the power of words is quite often the most inclusive medium, meaning, and the more simple that you make the words. And this is why I had to say, I love all the stories really for its simplicity and clarity. And trying to do this work myself, is that it is the most difficult thing to speak about extremely complex and emotional, conflictual events through everyday language. And I think all of you have done such a fantastic job, and I know how difficult it is. And it's very obvious how much words and thoughts and also disciplinary knowledge that all of you have put into your words, because maybe that doesn't across straight if we just look at the words themselves as you read them, but in the discussions, it became very apparent to me is that all of you were trying to moderate and was very careful with your choice of words, so that you can reach multiple generations, you can reach multiple audience, and you can reach multiple disciplines. And I do think that that I'm really, really happy, and I'm very proud that many of you are trained in architecture, and many of you continue to want to continue to study architects. And I would say that really keep that skill, because the power of words combined with the power of visualization and drawing and space making is some of the most exciting skills and potentials all of you have. And the role of architecture is for you to reinvent, meaning there might be a lot of limitations to the way that architecture is practiced today in Toronto or everywhere in the world. But I would say that if one were to look broader around the world, a lot of the questions that you've been asking about, how do we preserve a cultural heritage, but at the same time modernize and go forward? And I would say that, I had just arrived in Toronto 8 months ago. So I live very close to campus, University of Toronto. So I have really benefited from the comfort that is Chinatown, because I have lived in Hong Kong for 15 years. So when we walked down Spadina, it was very emotional to me. It was very emotional to be able to feel less homesick, even though I'm not from Hong Kong, but having lived in Hong Kong for 15 years, everything felt, very similar and very, very different. But I would say that a lot of the design and architectural community in Asian countries, right, in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in Taiwan, Japan, in China, they're actually confronting some of these issues that when you're speaking specifically about Chinatown, they have been confronting these as well for 20, 30 years with a bit more capacity and community and support. So I have actually learned a lot from the last 15 years, 20 years of working in Asia, just seeing and learning from my colleagues there who really confront that. How do you keep tradition while looking to the future, right? How do you modernize without losing some of the textures and messiness that is necessary? And I would say that if for those who are really looking for design, specifically architectural design solutions or inspirations from that, rather than looking further towards the West, I invite you to look back towards the East, because they're really leading on this front as well. So I'll stop at that, and I just want to say thank you very much, everyone, for sharing all of your thoughts.
Thank
With
you,
that-
Dean. We
Yeah, thank you.
appreciate it. I'm sorry, Erica, I'm gonna hand it over to you. It's on you
Well,
now.
I wish we could continue this conversation. We're already over time, but thank you so much, Dean Du, for sharing some of your thoughts as well. And hopefully all of us can sort of think again about the role of speculative fiction and dreaming as an activity, sort of unfettered, in which you're testing weak associations and strong associations and just sort of sorting through and sifting through your life, and it changes your memories. Every new experience you have changes how you think about the previous memory. And so thinking about nostalgia for something that you've never really experienced, it's a very dreamlike kind of way of thinking about space and place and identity and transformation. So thank you so much for Biko and Linda. Thank for organizing this, moderating this, carrying it through the past 2 years and carrying it forward. Thank you to Michael, Evelyn, Amelia, and Amy so much for sharing your words again with us. As we've been talking about, the next event in the Daniels Faculty Winter Public Program Designed for Resilient Communities International Symposium will be tomorrow, bright and early, Friday, April 8th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. We hope to see you online again